If you're trying to understand the global economy right now, you are probably feeling bombarded by conflicting signals.
Yeah, it's a lot. Growth here, slowdown there, tariff threats. It's
Yeah.
confusing.
Exactly. We hear about rising growth in some places, but then investment is drying up. New tariffs are everywhere. And, well, central banks seem to be living on entirely different planets.
Hmm.
It feels almost impossible to synthesize.
It really does.
So, our mission today is to give you a perfect shortcut. We've gone through the UN's latest update, the September 2025 World Economic Situation and Prospects Report,
Hmm.
and we're cutting straight to the chase. The world seems stuck in the slow lane, think 2.5% growth. And it looks like it's driven entirely by two confusing, almost contradictory forces.
Right. There's this temporary boost from tariffs creating a kind of artificial high,
Yeah.
and then this massive policy contradiction globally that seems to be freezing long-term planning.
That 2.5% projection for both 2025 and 2026, that's really the core takeaway, isn't it?
It is. And look, this isn't a crisis scenario, not like 2008, but it is a worrying state of maybe policy paralysis. It feels like a slow-motion erosion of potential.
And just to put that number in context for you, 2.5% is way below the 3.2% average growth we saw before the pandemic.
Significantly below. We are settling into what the report actually calls a persistently lower trajectory.
Okay, so a clear, subdued outlook. And you mentioned these two big forces shaping everything. First, the chaotic effects of U.S. trade policy.
Yep, that's number one.
And second, this huge divergence in policy between the world's major economic powers.
Exactly. We really need to decode how these two pressures are, well, undermining global confidence.
And then we have to get to what sounds like the most alarming detail in the report later on, this shocking contraction in global development aid.
Yeah, that's critical. We can't miss that.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with what we're calling the tariff puzzle. If the long-term outlook is so sluggish, so challenging, why did the 2025 forecast actually see a slight upgrade? Just a tiny 0.1 percentage point nudge upwards from earlier projections. Seems weird.
It does seem counterintuitive, right? But what's fascinating here is that small upgrade is driven almost entirely by something temporary called front-loading.
Front-loading, meaning companies rushing things.
Exactly. Front-loading simply means firms were basically racing the clock. They rushed to ship goods, kind of pulled forward economic activity to beat the deadline before these new U.S. tariffs fully kicked in.
Ah, okay. So we saw this temporary export surge that created a kind of artificial high, like borrowing a bit of economic activity from later in the year and stuffing it into the spring.
Precisely. That explains a lot of it.
Yeah.
And that was coupled with the fact that the actual effective U.S. tariff rate settled a bit lower than some of the most dramatic rates initially announced back in April.
Right, I remember those headlines.
Yeah, so it ended up being a little over 18% rather than the nearly 28% that was being talked about initially. That provided a small aggregate upward nudge.
Okay.
And, we also saw some pro-growth fiscal policies in large economies like China contributing a little bit too.
But the key word there is temporary. Once that front-loading effect fades, the real consequences of those tariffs kick in, and the true headwind begins.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
The full weight of these significantly higher tariffs is, well, it's about to permeate the global economy.
Mm.
And that's expected to weigh heavily on business investment and also on consumer demand.
So the uncertainty lingers.
Oh, definitely.
Oh.
While thankfully a truly catastrophic escalation seems to have been avoided for now, economic uncertainties remain really elevated. They're tracking at the high levels you see in things like the world policy uncertainty and the trade policy uncertainty indices. Businesses just hate uncertainty.
And you can almost see that pause bleeding into the real-time numbers already.
You can, yeah. High-frequency indicators are already showing the strain. For instance, the Global Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, the PMI, which is essentially, the monthly report card for global factories,
Right.
it actually fell back into contraction territory in July. That was after just a short-lived improvement in June. So the positive sentiment isn't really holding up.
Let's stick with those tariffs for a moment, because the numbers you mentioned are, frankly, startling. The overall U.S. tariff rate has surged, sevenfold since 2024? Pushing it past 18%?
Yeah, that 18% plus figure marks the highest tariff level imposed by the U.S. since the 1930s. It's a massive return to, economic statecraft, you could call it.
Wow, since the 30s.
And the impact is spread really widely. Most U.S. trading partners are now facing increases ranging anywhere from 10% up to a staggering 50%.
On what kind of goods?
We're seeing tariffs specifically imposed under Section 232 hitting basic industrial materials, think aluminum, copper, steel, auto parts, the foundational elements of global manufacturing.
So when tariffs jump that high, that fast, and policy becomes so unpredictable, how does that actually affect business planning on the ground?
Well, it creates this crisis of confidence, really. It leads to a pervasive wait-and-see approach. Firms just postpone major capital expenditures, they hold off on big investments.
Makes sense.
And there was an April survey across OECD countries, developed economies primarily, that revealed 70% of respondents anticipated decreased investment in 2025.
70%. That is absolutely paralyzing. Just stop.
It's a huge number. And this investment slowdown is doubly concerning because, remember, many economies haven't even recovered the real investment levels they lost during the pandemic.
Right. Still playing catch up from COVID.
Exactly. So prolonged weakness now in capital expenditure, it constrains productivity growth,
Yeah.
and fundamentally, it erodes the long-term potential of the global economy. That's the real worry.
And you mentioned the impact isn't uniform. The regional effects of this tariff shock seem wildly uneven. Some developed economies seem to have navigated it, maybe by making strategic concessions.
That's the complex dynamic we're seeing. Developed Asia, specifically Japan and South Korea, they saw their growth forecasts lowered initially because these tariffs really hammered their automotive and steel exports. Big sectors for them.
Okay.
However, they managed to mitigate some of the damage.
Right.
They secured reduced rates, but it came at a price. It was in exchange for new trade agreements that basically mandated increased investment commitments in the United States.
So they traded tariff pain for investment obligations back in the U.S.
Essentially, yes, a complex bargain.
But then we look at the developing world and the policy shock becomes, well, profound. Take Africa, for instance.
Yeah, the situation there is quite different. The immediate shock is the expiration of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. That's set for September 2025, so
Yeah.
very soon.
And AGO, remind us, that gave preferential access.
Exactly. AGOA previously granted duty-free access to the U.S. market for many African exports. Its expiration means those goods, particularly things like textiles and apparel, will suddenly be subjected to some of the highest effective U.S. tariff rates, like overnight.
Wow. What's the specific impact there? Can you quantify it?
Well, for a major manufacturing hub like South Africa, for example, they are suddenly looking at potentially an additional 30% tariff on key exports to the U.S.
30%. Just add it on.
Added on, it's a colossal headwind for development and manufacturing in that region. It immediately undercuts their price competitiveness. So this tariff puzzle isn't just a commercial issue for big economies, it's rapidly becoming a major development challenge for others.
That economic pain, then, created by all this trade uncertainty, it leads us pretty neatly into the next big problem you flagged, this great policy divergence. Monetary policy globally just can't seem to solve these issues because, as you said, central banks are operating in completely different domestic realities.
That really is the crux of the contradiction right now. We are seeing major economies moving in completely opposite directions, and it all depends on their specific domestic inflation drivers.
Okay, let's break that down. Start with the biggest economy, the United States. We know underlying growth has slowed down. The 2025 forecast is pretty meager, 1.6%. If growth is slowing, why is the Fed still holding the line, keeping rates relatively high? What's driving that stubborn 3.1% core inflation?
Yeah, the problem in the U.S. isn't so much goods inflation anymore, it's services. Inflation there is proving really sticky, or as the UN report puts it, it's bottoming out rather than falling sharply. And that's largely because services inflation remains high, around 3.8%.
And that's driven by...
Well, it reflects a persistently tight labor market and, sticky wage growth that comes with it. So the Fed held its policy rate steady, keeping it up there between 4.25% and 4.5% right through the summer of 2025. They're basically waiting for really conclusive evidence of a weakening labor market before they even consider aggressive cuts. They don't want to cut too soon.
Okay, so the Fed's on hold, waiting. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe seems to be in a completely different stage of the cycle.
Completely different, yeah. The European story is really one of aggressive easing. Inflation in the euro area has successfully eased down much closer to their 2% target.
How did they manage that?
It was largely supported by moderating wages, but also significant declines in energy prices, which hit Europe harder initially. So the European Central Bank, the ECB, responded by cutting rates quite aggressively. They reduced their benchmark deposit facility rate from 3% back in January down to 2% by July 2025.
Wow, that's a big move down.
It is. So their outlook is for a mild upturn, around 1.2% growth, but it's actively being supported by that central bank easing. So you have this stark contrast. The U.S. holds firm, Europe cuts dramatically.
And this divergence isn't just a developed world story, right? It's just as sharp in the developing world.
Absolutely. You see pockets of strength and struggle everywhere. China, for example, remains an important relative bright spot. Their growth was actually revised upward to 4.9% for 2025.
Why the upgrade for China?
It's due to pretty aggressive fiscal and monetary easing. They've cut interest rates and reserve requirement ratios for banks. Plus, again, that temporary export surge from the tariff front-loading we talked about.
Yeah.
But there's always a but with China. Subdued consumer sentiment remains a persistent cloud over their domestic economy. People still aren't spending freely.
Okay. And what about Latin America?
Latin America looks more subdued overall, forecast around 2.2% growth for both 2025 and 2026. And policy is sharply divergent, even within the continent. You have Brazil actually tightening monetary policy to try and rein in its own stubborn domestic inflation.
Going the opposite way again.
Right. While Mexico and some others are cautiously easing rates. And then the region's big anomaly is Argentina, which, after a really sharp necessary contraction, is projected to bounce back dramatically with maybe 5.3% growth in 2025. So a real mixed bag.
So, okay, let's pull the threads together. We have slow growth overall, fragmented trade due to tariffs, conflicting interest rate paths. The unifying theme seems to be that this combination of subdued growth and, for many, elevated interest payments means governments just lack what economists call fiscal space, room to maneuver.
That's a great way to put it. Fiscal space is simply the room a government has to spend or borrow without risking default or, runaway inflation. And high debt is becoming a medium-term concern even for developed nations. U.S. debt, just as an example, is projected to reach nearly 128% of GDP by 2034 under current policies.
A huge number.
It is. And interestingly, we're seeing some developed nations, like Germany, actually easing their traditionally strict fiscal stance, maybe committing more spending to things like defense and infrastructure, realizing there's a need for strategic investment despite the debt levels.
But that option, that fiscal space, it's just not there for much of the developing world, right? The constraint must be absolutely crippling there.
It really is.
Yeah.
Limited government revenue combined with rising debt burdens means many developing countries simply cannot implement any countercyclical policies. They can't spend to offset trade shocks or periods of slow growth.
And this is where we introduce the final and perhaps most severe problem you flagged earlier, the ODA crisis, official development assistance.
Yes. And this, to me, is the truly alarming data point in the UN update. Global Official Development Assistance ODA, which is essentially the foreign aid provided by developed nations to developing ones. It's expected to shrink by a further 9 to 17% in 2025.
9 to 17% on top of previous drops.
Exactly. When you combine that with the prior year's drop, this represents the sharpest two-year decline in ODA in decades. Decades.
A contraction of that magnitude must be immediate and devastating for the most vulnerable nations.
It is. It's catastrophic. In many low-income and vulnerable countries, ODA actually accounts for over 20% and sometimes much more of total government expenditure.
20%. Wow.
Yeah. So this drastic cut directly threatens funding for the most essential services. Think basic health, education, climate adaptation measures. The compounding impact of shrinking aid flows, combined with restrictive trade policy and their own domestic fiscal constraints. It seriously risks reversing years of hard-won progress on poverty reduction.
Which makes those international commitments to mobilize resources, like the Sustainable Development Goals, absolutely critical, but also harder to achieve.
Incredibly critical and incredibly challenged right now. We did see a positive move with the adoption of the Sevilla Commitment back in June. This is supposed to be a new framework aimed at mobilizing more public and private investment, tackling the global debt crisis more effectively, and reforming the international financial architecture. The goal is to close that estimated $4 trillion annual gap in sustainable development financing.
So there's a plan, a commitment on paper?
There is. That commitment offers a potential path forward. But the immediate reality right now is a steep, sharp funding squeeze for those who need it most, precisely when they need it most.
Okay, let's try to recap the core tension here for everyone listening. The global economy is growing slowly, kind of stuck at 2.5%. It's heavily influenced right now by U.S. trade policy, which created this weird, temporary, front-loaded export boost.
But which will soon likely give way to a much more persistent investment chill because of the uncertainty.
Right. And meanwhile, the major central banks, particularly the ECB in Europe and the Fed in the U.S., are acting in completely different realities, leading to this massive policy contradiction globally.
I think the most critical takeaway for you, the listener, is really the compounding risk here. On one hand, you have depressed investment globally, which limits our long-term potential growth. It caps our ceiling.
Hmm.
And on the other hand, you have these drastic, rapid cuts to official development assistance, that funding lifeline for the world's most vulnerable nations, which drastically heightens their immediate vulnerability and threatens vital human services. Those two factors together, frozen potential and shrinking aid, they really define the difficult trajectory of the global economy looking out through 2026.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, building on all this. If this new normal for global growth really is 2.5% and this policy divergence, this sevenfold tariff escalation continues, what specific sectors, beyond the obvious ones we mentioned, like automotive and textiles, do you think will be the first to permanently relocate their supply chains away from these major tariff zones? If firms truly believe that 70% of their peers are cutting investment, how long will it take for them to just assume that 2.5% growth is the ceiling, not the floor, for the next decade? Something to think about.